My name is Claire, and I'm 32 years old. For 6 years, I believed my husband when he said I was nothing without him. I believed it when he controlled our money, when he made me replant roses in the rain because they were the wrong color, and even that night when he abandoned me on a dark road miles from home to teach me a lesson. What he didn't know was that the black Mercedes that pulled up moments later didn't belong to just any driver. It belonged to someone who would help me discover that everything he'd ever told me about myself, about our marriage, about who owned what, was a carefully constructed lie. And the truth? It was about to cost him everything. If you're watching this, I'd love to know. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything? Drop your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding strength you didn't know you had. The champagne flutes clinked around me like delicate bells, and I smiled the way Daniel liked me to smile. Soft, demure, just present enough to be noticed, but not so much that I drew attention away from him. The charity gala glittered with wealth and false pleasantries, crystal chandeliers casting everything in a warm, deceptive glow. "Your wife looks stunning tonight, Daniel," someone said, and I felt his hand settle on the small of my back, possessive and warm. "She does, doesn't she?" Daniel's voice dripped with pride, the kind reserved for prized possessions. He leaned closer, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "Don't embarrass me tonight." The smile never left my face, but something inside me flinched. I'd heard those words before, in different variations, always delivered with that same casual cruelty disguised as concern. A waiter passed too close to our table, and champagne splashed near Daniel's sleeve. It didn't touch him, but his fingers found my wrist under the table, squeezing until I felt my bones protest. I kept smiling. I'd learned to keep smiling. Later, in the car, rain began to streak the windows as we drove through the city. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, watching the lights blur into watercolor streaks. My wrist throbbed beneath my bracelet. "You were quiet tonight," Daniel said, his tone neutral but weighted with meaning. "I thought you wanted me quiet," I replied softly. "I want you present, Claire. There's a difference." I didn't ask him to explain. I'd learned that too. Some questions only led to longer lectures about my failings. At home, I changed into comfortable clothes and went to make tea. Daniel stood in the doorway of our kitchen, surveying the space like a general inspecting troops. "The roses," he said suddenly. I turned, teacup halfway to my lips. "What about them? They're the wrong color." I specifically said I wanted red. "Those are coral." I looked out the window at the garden where I'd spent 3 weekends on my knees, carefully selecting and planting each bush. The nursery said these were heritage red. They're supposed to deepen as they bloom. I don't care what the nursery said. They're wrong. You'll need to replant them. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The weather forecast had called for storms all week. "Now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's for the good of the marriage, Claire. We can't have a garden that looks careless." So, I went outside in the rain. The soil turned to mud beneath my fingers as I dug up each plant, the thorns catching on my skin through my gardening gloves. Daniel watched from the covered porch, occasionally calling out instructions. When I finally came inside 2 hours later, drenched and shaking, he'd already gone to bed. I stood in the bathroom, washing mud from beneath my fingernails, and caught my reflection in the mirror. When had I become this woman? When had I stopped recognizing myself? The credit card declined at the grocery store the next Tuesday. I tried it again, certain it was a mistake, but the cashier's sympathetic smile told me everything. "Do you have another card?" Yes, just a moment." I fumbled through my wallet, trying the second card. Declined. The third. Declined. The line behind me grew restless. He crept up my neck as I apologized, abandoning the cart and walking quickly to my car. My hands shook as I called Daniel. "Oh, that," he said casually, as if we were discussing the weather. I consolidated our accounts. "It's easier to manage everything in one place. Just use the household card I left on the counter." "You didn't tell me you were doing that." "Do I need to notify you of every financial decision I make?" "I'm the one who earns the money, Claire. I'm just being efficient." The call ended before I could respond. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at my declined cards, feeling something vital slip away from me, something I hadn't even realized I still possessed. Mrs. Whitaker caught me in the driveway a few days later. Our elderly neighbor had lived on the street for 30 years and seemed to notice everything from her front window. "Claire, dear, I've been meaning to ask, are you all right?" I pasted on the smile that had become my default expression. "Of course, Mrs. Whitaker. Why do you ask?" Her roomy eyes searched my face. "You just seem different lately. Quieter. Just busy with the house and everything. You know how it is." She patted my hand, her papery skin warm against mine. "If you ever need anything, dear. Anything at all." "Thank you. That's very kind." I felt Daniel's presence before I saw him, that particular weight of his gaze. He stood on our porch, arms crossed, watching. Mrs. Whitaker noticed too, and her hand tightened briefly on mine before she let go. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," she said, but her eyes held concern as she walked away. That night, Daniel mentioned it casually over dinner. "What was Mrs. Whitaker talking to you about?" "Nothing important. Just neighborly chat. She's a gossip, you know. I'd be careful what you say around her." I didn't say anything. Good. He cut his steak with precise movements. Because some people love to misunderstand things. To make problems where there aren't any. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone. I found my old sketchbooks one rainy afternoon while Daniel was at work. They'd been buried in a box in the back of the closet, relics from my life before marriage. I'd studied interior design, had dreams of opening my own firm. My fingers traced the drawings, living rooms full of light, kitchens designed for laughter, spaces meant for actual living. When had I stopped drawing? When had I put these away? Daniel came home early and found me on the floor, surrounded by sketches. "What's all this?" His tone was light, but I heard the edge underneath. "Just some old work. From college." He picked up a sketch, studied it briefly, then set it down. "Art doesn't pay bills, Claire. You're lucky I do." "I know. I was just looking." "Well, maybe you should focus on the present instead of dwelling on the past. There's laundry to fold." After he left the room, I carefully packed the sketchbooks away. But that night, unable to sleep, I took out a small notebook and began writing. Not designs this time, but letters. Letters to myself, to the woman I used to be, to the woman I might still become. Each entry ended the same way: "One day I'll walk away dry." I didn't know what it meant yet, but writing it made something in my chest feel less tight. The dinner party happened on a Friday. Daniel's business partner Richard and his wife Emily came over, and I prepared everything exactly as Daniel had instructed. The right wine, the right appetizers, conversation kept light and pleasant. We were discussing Richard's recent vacation when Emily mentioned a restaurant they'd visited. "Oh, wasn't it the place Marcus recommended?" I asked absently, then felt the temperature in the room drop. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Richard shifted in his seat. "Marcus?" Richard asked. I realized my mistake immediately. Marcus Chun had been a client Daniel mentioned once, late at night when he'd had too much whiskey. A client he'd said was handled quietly. I'd thought it was just business talk, but the look on Daniel's face now told me I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to know. "I must be misremembering," I said quickly. "Sorry, I'm terrible with names." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Claire sometimes gets her wires crossed. Don't you, darling?" The rest of the evening passed in suffocating politeness. After Richard and Emily left, Daniel's silence during cleanup was worse than any shouting could have been. In the car, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "How do you know about Marcus Chun?" "You mentioned him once." "I didn't realize it was a secret." "You didn't realize." His laugh was hollow. "Do you know what you could have done tonight? Do you have any idea?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Tomorrow," he interrupted, his voice eerily calm, "you'll learn your place." We pulled into the driveway, and I got out of the car on shaking legs. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall as we walked into the house. That night, I lay awake while Daniel slept beside me, his breathing even and undisturbed. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm build outside, and something in me whispered that everything was about to change. I just didn't know how right it was. "We're going for a drive." Daniel announced it over breakfast, his tone deceptively light, as if he were suggesting a pleasant afternoon outing rather than whatever he'd been planning since last night. I looked out the window at the darkening sky, clouds heavy and bruised with the promise of rain. "Where are we going?" I asked, wrapping my sweater tighter around myself. "Does it matter?" He was already grabbing his keys. "Get in the car, Claire." I knew better than to argue. I'd learned the hard way that resistance only prolonged things, made them worse. So I followed him to the car, sliding into the passenger seat and buckling my seatbelt with hands that wouldn't quite steady. We drove in silence, the windshield wipers keeping rhythm with my heartbeat. Daniel took us away from the familiar streets of our neighborhood, away from the main roads, toward the rural back roads that twisted through fields and forgotten farms. The kind of roads where you could drive for miles without seeing another soul. The rain started slowly, then built into a steady downpour that turned the world outside into a gray blur. I watched the drops race down my window and tried not to think about where we were going, what he had planned. My stomach churned with a dread I couldn't name. "Daniel," I finally said, my voice barely audible over the rain. "What are we doing out here?" He didn't answer. Just kept driving, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, he pulled over onto a gravel shoulder next to an empty field. Nothing but grass and rain and darkness in every direction. The nearest house had to be miles away. He put the car in park and turned off the engine, and suddenly the only sound was the rain hammering on the roof. "Last night," he said, staring straight ahead, "you embarrassed me. You showed Richard that you can't be trusted with information, that you don't know when to keep your mouth shut. It was an accident, I swear I didn't mean." "I don't care what you meant." He turned to look at me then, and his eyes were cold in a way that made my blood freeze. "You need to understand humility, Claire. You need to remember who you are and who I am." He reached across me and unlocked my door. The sound was deafening in the small space. "Get out." For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. "What?" "Get out of the car. You'll walk home. You'll have plenty of time to think about what you've done." "Daniel, please, it's pouring. We're miles from home. It's dark." "Then you'll remember this lesson, won't you?" His smile was terrible. "Or maybe you won't challenge me in front of my colleagues again." "I didn't challenge you. My voice broke. "Please don't do this. Out. Now." When I didn't move, he leaned over me and pushed my door open. Rain immediately swept into the car, soaking my sleeve. The message was clear. I could get out on my own, or he would make me. I stepped out into the rain. The door slammed behind me, and I stood there frozen, watching through the streaming window as Daniel put the car in drive. For one wild moment, I thought he wouldn't actually do it. He'd tell me to get back in. This was just meant to scare me. But the tires hissed on the wet road, and the car pulled away, and I stood there watching the red taillights disappear into the rain until even those were gone. The rain was cold. Not the romantic kind of rain for movies, but the kind that soaked through clothes in seconds and turned the world into a hostile, drowning place. My sweater clung to me, heavy and useless. My hair plastered to my face. Mascara ran into my eyes, stinging. I started walking. Each step felt endless. The gravel road turned to mud that sucked at my shoes. My phone was in my purse, which was in the car. Of course it was. Daniel never forgot details like that. The memories came unbidden as I walked, flashing through my mind with each step. Our first date, when he'd been so charming, so attentive. My parents' quiet concerns at the wedding. "Are you sure about this, Claire?" My mother's hand on my arm, her eyes searching mine for doubt. The first time he'd raised his voice, and how I'd excused it as stress from work. The first time he'd grabbed my wrist too hard, and how he'd apologized so profusely afterward that I'd believed it was a one-time thing. When had the apologies stopped? When had I stopped expecting them? A truck roared past, close enough that I felt the rush of air and was doused in muddy water from the puddle it plowed through. I stumbled, nearly fell, and that's when something broke open inside me. I laughed. It was a bitter, broken sound, but it came from somewhere deep and true. I stood there in the middle of that dark road, covered in mud and rain, and laughed until tears joined the water streaming down my face. "I'm so done," I whispered to the storm. "I'm so done with this." The words felt like a revelation, like the first true thing I'd said in years. I don't know how long I walked before I saw the bus stop. It was one of those ancient rural stops, just a bench and a rusted awning that provided minimal shelter. But it was something. I collapsed onto the bench, shivering, and pulled my knees to my chest. The rage came then, hot and clarifying. Not the explosive kind, but something colder, sharper. Something that felt like waking up. "You wanted me broken," I said aloud, my voice steadier than it had been all night. "But you just freed me." Because that's what it was, wasn't it? This was the moment. The one I'd been waiting for without knowing it. The moment when the scales finally tipped, when the weight of staying became heavier than the terror of leaving. I sat under that broken awning and watched the rain, and for the first time in years, I felt something other than fear or numbness. I felt clear. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. For a panicked moment, I thought it might be Daniel, coming back to finish the lesson with more cruelty. But as the car drew closer, I saw it was a black Mercedes, sleek and expensive. It pulled up beside the bus stop, and the window lowered. A woman looked out at me, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to concern in rapid succession. It took me a moment to place her face, to connect it with memories from another lifetime. "Claire?" Laura Finch stared at me like I was a ghost. "Oh my God. What happened to you?" "Laura. My father's colleague's daughter. We'd been friendly in college, lost touch after graduation. I knew she'd gone to law school, become some kind of attorney, but the details were hazy. My voice came out raspy. My husband left me here." Her face went through another rapid series of expressions before settling on something fierce and determined. "Get in the car. Now." I didn't argue. I climbed into the warm, dry interior of her Mercedes, and she immediately cranked up the heat. She pulled a towel from her gym bag in the back seat and handed it to me. "Here. You're shaking." I wrapped the towel around myself, and that's when I started crying. Not the bitter laughter from before, but real tears, the kind that felt like they'd been building for years. Laura drove without asking questions, letting me cry myself out. Finally, when my breathing steadied, she spoke quietly. "Claire, you look like hell." "I feel like hell." "Good." She glanced at me, and something in her eyes made my spine straighten. Because the woman I remember from college wouldn't have let anyone treat her like this. And I think that woman is still in there somewhere. I wiped my face with the towel, smearing makeup and rain and tears. "Is she?" "Yeah." Laura's smile was small but sharp. "And you don't know it yet, but tonight changes everything." Laura took me to a quiet downtown cafe, one of those places that stayed open late for insomniacs and lost souls. The warmth hit me like a wall when we walked in, and I realized I couldn't feel my fingers. She steered me to a corner booth and ordered hot tea before I could even look at the menu. When the steaming cup arrived, I wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat seep back into my bones. Laura sat across from me, watching with the kind of focused attention that made me understand why she'd become a lawyer. "How long?" she asked simply. "How long has what been happening?" "Claire." I took a sip of tea, buying time, but her gaze didn't waver. 5 years, I finally said. Maybe 6. It's hard to pinpoint when things shifted from just difficult to actually wrong. She nodded slowly. "Your father was worried about you." The words hit me like a slap. "My father? He died 8 months ago." "I know. I was his attorney for the last year of his life." Laura pulled out a leather portfolio from her bag. "He suspected something was off with Daniel. So he asked me to look into a few things." My hands tightened around the teacup. "What kind of things? Do you remember that property he inherited? The commercial building downtown? The one Daniel said my father left to both of us?" Laura's expression was grim. "It was never left to Daniel." Your father's trust had very specific clauses. That property, along with several other assets, were meant to go to you, and only you. But there was a condition. What condition? If Daniel was found to be manipulating your finances or using your legal identity for fraudulent purposes, the assets would revert to you immediately, and Daniel would have no claim. I set down the teacup because my hands had started shaking again. I don't understand. Daniel handles all our finances. He said it was easier, that I didn't need to worry. That's exactly what your father was afraid of. Laura opened the portfolio and slid documents across the table. Even in my dazed state, I could see financial statements, account summaries, legal papers stamped and notarized. Your father left a substantial trust, Claire. You're not broke. You've never been broke. Daniel has been filtering everything through accounts that make it look like he's the sole provider, but legally. She tapped the papers. You're wealthier than your husband. Significantly wealthier. The cafe seemed to tilt around me. I thought I had nothing. He said, he's always said I'd be nothing without him. He lied. Laura's voice was gentle but firm. And he's been systematically isolating you from your own resources. Classic financial abuse. I stared at the documents, the numbers swimming before my eyes. How is this possible? I would have had to sign things there would have been. There's more. Laura pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Daniel has been using your identity, forging your signature on documents. He set up shell accounts in your name and has been moving money through them, money from business deals that weren't exactly legal. My stomach dropped. What kind of deals? The kind that involved tax fraud and embezzlement. He was using your name as a shield, Claire. If it ever came to light, you would have been the one implicated. He was building a paper trail that led straight to you while keeping himself clean. I thought I might be sick. All those times he'd brought papers home, asked me to sign without reading them because it's just routine stuff. Claire, trust me. All those times I'd been too tired, too worn down to question. He tried to frame me, I whispered. Yes. The word hung between us, simple and devastating. I don't know how long we sat there. Laura ordered more tea, and I worked through the shock in waves. Disbelief, anger, grief, and underneath it all, a growing sense of betrayal so profound it felt physical. All those times he said I'd be nothing without him, I said finally. He was really saying he'd be nothing without me. Without my name, my father's money, my identity to hide behind. Exactly. Laura leaned forward. Your father knew something was wrong. He couldn't prove it before he died, but he made sure the legal framework was in place for when you were ready. Ready for what? To fight back. The words should have terrified me. Instead, they ignited something. That same clarity I'd felt standing in the rain, but stronger now, burning away the last of my numbness. What do I need to do? Laura's smile was fierce. First, you need to let him think everything is normal. He can't know we've talked or what you know. Can you do that? Could I? Could I go back to that house, look him in the eye, and pretend to be the broken woman he'd left in the rain? I thought about my old sketchbooks hidden in the closet, the letters I'd written to myself, the woman I used to be, and the woman I'd been slowly becoming in secret. Yes, I said. I can do that. Good. Because we're going to take back everything he stole from you. Your money, your identity, your power. Laura started gathering the papers. And by the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. I went home just before dawn. Laura dropped me a block away, and I walked up our driveway as the first gray light touched the sky. My clothes had mostly dried, leaving me rumpled and wrinkled, but not obviously soaked. Daniel was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, looking annoyingly fresh and rested. He glanced up when I entered, and I saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes that I'd made it back so soon. Did you think about your mistake? He asked, taking a sip of coffee. I thought about Laura's documents, about my father's trust, about the shell accounts in my name, about how thoroughly Daniel had underestimated me. I smiled faintly. Yes, I did. Good. He went back to his phone, dismissing me already. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and stood in the shower until the hot water ran cold, washing away the rain and the mud and the last traces of the woman who would have begged for his forgiveness. When I emerged, wrapped in a towel, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My eyes looked different somehow. Clearer. Harder. "You taught me humility," I whispered to my reflection. "Now I'll teach you consequence." The next few days were a careful dance. I played my part perfectly, the chastened wife, a little quieter than usual, a little more withdrawn. Daniel interpreted it exactly as I'd hoped, as submission, as victory. He took me to dinner that Friday, making a show of it at an expensive restaurant where half his colleagues happened to be dining. "Look how magnanimous I am," the gesture said. "Look how forgiving." I smiled and nodded, and played my role while checking my phone discreetly between courses. Laura's texts were brief, but effective. Phase 1 complete. Property transfer filed this morning. Phase 2 underway. His business accounts are under review. Judge approved the preliminary injunction. He just doesn't know it yet. Each message was a small victory, a brick removed from the prison Daniel had built around me. That night, in the garden, I hummed while I watered the plants. Daniel watched from the window, and I could feel his confusion like a tangible thing. Something in my demeanor had shifted, something he couldn't quite identify, but that clearly unsettled him. "You're acting strange," he said when he came outside. I looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Am I? You seem, I don't know, different." "I'm just trying to be better," I said sweetly. "Isn't that what you wanted?" He studied me for a long moment before going back inside, and I returned to my watering with a small smile playing at my lips. Laura and I met in secret twice more that week. Once at her office downtown, where I signed document after document authorizing asset transfers, filing complaints, initiating audits. My hand cramped from all the signatures, but each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. "How long before he notices?" I asked. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how closely he's monitoring things. But when it hits..." Laura grinned. "It'll hit all at once." The second meeting was at her apartment, where she walked me through what to expect. The legal process, the likely reactions, the ways Daniel might try to fight back. "He'll get angry," she warned. "Probably violent. You need to be ready to leave at a moment's notice." "I'm ready," I said, and meant it. She gave me a burner phone, programmed with her number and emergency contacts. "Keep this hidden. If anything happens, anything at all, you call me immediately." I tucked the phone into the lining of my purse, a secret lifeline. 2 weeks after that night in the rain, I sat in her home office while Daniel was at work. Spread before me was the legal folder Laura had given me, stamped with official seals and signatures. Property reversion. Filed and approved. Asset protection order, in effect. Preliminary fraud investigation initiated. Each document was another nail in the coffin Daniel had built for himself, thinking all along he was building one for me. I heard his car in the driveway and quickly filed everything away in my new hiding spot, a locked drawer in the desk that Daniel never touched because he thought it contained only my silly art supplies. When he came upstairs, I was sketching in my old notebook, something I'd started doing again openly. Let him think it was harmless. Let him think I was predictable. "What are you drawing?" he asked. "Just playing around. Nothing important." He glanced at the sketch, a living room filled with light, and made a dismissive sound before leaving. That night, I added another line to my secret letters. "The storm you created is about to break. And this time, you're the one standing in the rain." Daniel's confidence returned gradually, like a predator sensing its prey has stopped running. I watched it happen with a kind of detached fascination, the way he began to relax again, to laugh more freely, to treat me with that particular brand of magnanimous condescension that I now recognized as cruelty, wearing a smile. At dinner with his colleague James, he actually said, "Sometimes a little lesson puts them back in line, you know? Claire's been much more agreeable lately." I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting my chicken into precise pieces, and thought about the asset protection order sitting in Laura's office with my signature on it. The men laughed, James making some comment about keeping the peace at home, and I imagined the look on their faces when Daniel's world collapsed. "You're quiet tonight," Daniel observed on the drive home. Just listening, I replied. Isn't that what you prefer? He patted my knee, satisfied. That's my girl. My phone buzzed in my purse, not my regular phone, but the burner Laura had given me. I felt its vibration like an electric current. But I waited until Daniel was asleep that night before checking it in the bathroom, the door locked, water running in the sink to mask any sound. Phase 2 complete. He no longer owns the villa. Properties transferred to your name only. Bank should notify him tomorrow morning. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, at this woman who looked like me but felt like someone new. Someone stronger. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow it begins. The bank called while we were having breakfast. Daniel's phone rang, and I watched his face as he answered. Watched the subtle shift from casual to confused to concerned. What do you mean there's a problem with the account? He stood, pacing toward his office. No, I'm the primary holder. There must be some… What? The door closed, but I could still hear his voice rising, muffled but unmistakably angry. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the warmth ground me, and waited. When he emerged 20 minutes later, his face was flushed, his jaw tight in that way that used to make me flinch. Now, it just made me more alert, more focused. Did you go to the bank recently? He demanded.
No.
Why? There's some mix-up with the accounts. They're saying you're the primary holder on several properties and accounts. Did you sign something? I let confusion cloud my features. Sign something? Daniel, you know I don't handle any of that. You always say I'd just mess it up. He stared at me, searching for deception, but I'd practiced this moment with Laura. I knew how to hold his gaze without flinching, how to project innocent bewilderment. It must be an error, he muttered finally. I'll go down there and sort it out. I'm sure you will, I said softly. He left in a fury, tires squealing as he backed out of the driveway. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I pulled out the burner phone and texted Laura. He knows about the accounts. Her response came immediately. Good. Let him panic. Do not deviate from the plan. He came home that evening like a storm given human form, slamming doors and throwing his briefcase across the living room. What did you do? He roared. I was in the kitchen, calmly chopping vegetables for dinner. The knife felt steady in my hand, and I took a moment before turning to face him. What are you talking about? The accounts, Claire. The properties. My business account is frozen. The villa is in your name only. The investment portfolio. He stopped, breathing hard.
What did you do?
I set down the knife carefully and wiped my hands on a dish towel. When I spoke, my voice was level and calm in a way that seemed to infuriate him further. Nothing you wouldn't have done to me. His face went through several colors. That's impossible. You don't know anything about our finances. You're too stupid to. Too stupid to notice you've been using my name to commit fraud? The words came out cooler than I'd intended, sharper. Too stupid to realize you've been setting me up to take the fall for your embezzlement? Please, Daniel, give me some credit. I watched understanding dawn on his face, followed quickly by fury. He took a step toward me, and I felt my heart rate spike, but I didn't back away. Couldn't back away. This was the moment. You have no idea what you've done, he said, his voice dropping to something dangerous and low. I will destroy you. I'll tell everyone you're crazy, unstable. You'll what? I interrupted, and there was something almost exhilarating about finally speaking over him. Tell them how your wife is actually the one with the money? How you've been living off her inheritance while systematically stealing from her. Nobody will believe you. They don't have to believe me. I picked up my phone, my regular phone this time, and pulled up a document, turning the screen toward him. They just have to believe the forensic accountant, and the IRS investigator, and the judge who granted the asset protection order. The color drained from his face as he read, his eyes scanning back and forth in growing horror. You can't, this is impossible. You're too. He caught himself, but we both heard what he'd been about to say.
Too weak.
Too broken. Too nothing. I said quietly. But you know what changed? I met his eyes, and I didn't look away. You left me in the rain, and for the first time in years, I could finally see clearly. The next hour was chaos. Daniel tried everything: threats, pleas, accusations, attempts at gaslighting that might have worked a month ago, but now just slid off me like water. I let him rage while I packed a suitcase with calm, methodical precision. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "Somewhere you don't control." I zipped the suitcase closed. "Somewhere I can breathe." "You can't just leave. This is my house." "Actually," I interrupted, pulling out another document from my bag, "according to the property deed filed last week, it's my house. You might want to start looking for an apartment." His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist, the same wrist he'd bruised at the gala, healed now but remembered. The old Claire would have frozen, would have apologized, would have done anything to de-escalate. But I wasn't her anymore. "Let go," I said, my voice steady. "Or what?" I looked pointedly at the corner of the room where a small security camera blinked its steady red light, one of several Laura had helped me install last week while Daniel was at work. "Or your assault charge becomes assault and battery," I said calmly. "Your choice." He released me like I'd burned him, stumbling back. The look on his face was almost worth everything: shock, betrayal, the dawning realization that he'd fundamentally miscalculated who I was and what I was capable of. I picked up my suitcase and walked to the door. Behind me, I could hear him starting to cry, actual tears, and there was a time when that sound would have broken me, would have set me running back to comfort him. "Not anymore. Claire, please." His voice cracked. "We can fix this. I'll get help, I'll change, just please don't." "You said I needed a lesson," I said without turning around. "Consider this yours." Outside, Laura's Mercedes was waiting at the curb, engine running. She got out and helped me with my suitcase, and as we drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. Daniel stood in the doorway, backlit and alone, and even from a distance, I could see him shaking. "You okay?" Laura asked. I thought about it, really thought about it. Was I okay? I'd just destroyed my marriage, possibly destroyed a man I'd once loved, upended my entire life. My hands should have been shaking. I should have been crying or panicking or regretting. Instead, I felt light. Lighter than I had in years. "Yeah," I said, surprised by how true it was. "I think I actually am." That night, in Laura's guest room, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety or fear, but from a kind of electric clarity that hummed through my veins. I sat by the window and watched the rain because of course it was raining, and thought about how different it looked from here. How the drops on the glass caught the streetlights and turned them into something almost beautiful. My phone buzzed. My regular phone this time, the one Daniel knew the number to. Against my better judgment, I checked it. 17 missed calls. 32 text messages. Each one more desperate than the last, cycling through anger and pleading and accusations and apologies in a pattern I recognized all too well. The same cycle he'd used 100 times before to reel me back in. I blocked his number and set the phone aside. The burner phone was next to it, and I picked that one up instead, scrolling through Laura's last message. "Tomorrow we file the restraining order and the divorce petition. Make sure you're ready for this to get uglier before it gets better." I typed back, "I'm ready." He taught me a lesson after all. Just not the one he intended. Her response came immediately. "That's my girl. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we go to war." I set the phone down and looked out at the rain again. Somewhere out there, Daniel was probably still crying or drinking or plotting his next move. He was probably telling himself this was all my fault, that I was the crazy one, that he was the victim. Let him think that. Let him believe whatever he needed to believe. Because tomorrow, when the legal papers started flying and the investigators started asking questions, and the whole carefully constructed lie of his life began to crumble, he'd learn what I'd learned that night in the rain. Sometimes the storm doesn't break you. Sometimes it wakes you up. The morning started deceptively peaceful. I woke in Laura's guest room to sunlight streaming through gauze curtains, the kind of gentle light that makes everything look softer, kinder. For a moment, just a moment, I forgot where I was and why. Then I remembered, and instead of the panic I expected, I felt only resolve. I made breakfast while Laura got ready for work, moving through her kitchen with the kind of calm that comes from finally finally being on the right side of truth. Eggs, toast, coffee. Simple things that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. "You're humming," Laura observed, appearing in the doorway with her briefcase. "Am I?" But I knew I was. I could feel the melody in my chest, something light and unburdened. "The rain stopped," I said, gesturing to the window where morning sun dried the last drops from the glass. Laura smiled, understanding everything I wasn't saying. "Ready for today?"
Today.
The day we filed the official paperwork. The day Daniel's carefully constructed world would begin its very public collapse. More than ready. By noon, Daniel's phone was apparently ringing off the hook. I knew this because Laura's assistant kept us updated. His business partner Alan had called the office 3 times, each message more frantic than the last. "They found the forged signatures," Laura said, reviewing emails on her tablet. "The ones Daniel used to set up those shell accounts in your name." We were in her office, 20th floor, glass walls overlooking the city. I stood by the window and watched tiny cars move through streets below, thinking about how different everything looked from up here. How small Daniel's cruelty seemed when you had the right perspective. "How long before he knows we filed?" I asked. "He's probably being served right now, actually." The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt something close to satisfaction, sharp and clean. Daniel's first public breakdown happened at his firm. I heard about it from Mrs. Whitaker, of all people, who called me that afternoon. "Claire, dear, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I thought you should know. There were police at your house this morning." And Daniel came home around lunch looking absolutely wrecked. He was shouting into his phone in the driveway. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Whitaker." "Are you safe, dear? Because if you need anything—" "I'm safe," I assured her and meant it. Safer than I've been in a long time. After we hung up, Laura pulled up a news alert on her computer. A small item, barely 3 paragraphs, but there, "Local financial advisor under investigation for fraud." "It's starting," she said. I read the article twice, seeing Daniel's name in print attached to words like embezzlement and investigation. Part of me, a small, dying part, felt something like pity. The rest of me remembered standing in the rain, remembered years of controlled cruelty, remembered every time he'd made me feel like I was nothing. "Let it start," I said. That evening, Daniel tried to come to Laura's building. The doorman called up and Laura handled it with professional efficiency. "Tell him Ms. Hartwell is unavailable and all communication should go through her attorney. That's me. If he refuses to leave, call the police." I listened from the living room, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and felt nothing but a strange, distant calm. The man downstairs raging at a doorman wasn't my husband anymore. Wasn't my problem. He was just a consequence of his own choices, finally catching up to him. "He left," Laura said, returning. "But Claire, he's going to try again. You need to be prepared for escalation." "I know."
And I did.
I'd lived with Daniel long enough to understand how he worked. When control slipped away, he didn't let go gracefully.
He fought.
He clawed. He tried to drag everyone down with him. But this time I was ready. The next morning brought 3 developments. First, Daniel's firm released an official statement distancing themselves from him, effective immediately. Second, a journalist from the local business section called Laura's office asking for comment. And third, Mrs. Whitaker sent me a file. Audio she'd recorded through her window 2 weeks ago, Daniel threatening me in our kitchen. "I almost deleted it," she wrote in her email. "But something told me you might need it. I hope I did the right thing." I sat in Laura's office and listened to the recording, heard Daniel's voice sharp with menace. "You'd be nothing without me. Do you understand? Nothing." And my own voice, so quiet I barely recognized it. "I understand."
But I hadn't understood, not then.
I'd thought he was speaking truth. Now I heard it for what it was, the desperate assertion of a man who knew, on some level, that he was the one who was nothing, who'd built his entire life on stolen foundations and borrowed credibility. "This is perfect," Laura said when I forwarded her the file. "Judge Peterson is going to love this." I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and sad, and beneath it all, relieved. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and could finally exhale. The courthouse was smaller than I expected. I'd built it up in my mind as this grand, imposing space, but it was just a building, marble floors, wooden benches, fluorescent lights that hummed faintly and reminded me of doctors' offices. Daniel sat across the aisle with his attorney, a sharp-faced woman who kept whispering urgently in his ear. He wore his best suit, the charcoal one he saved for important clients, and his hair was perfectly styled. But I could see the cracks in the facade, the tightness around his eyes, the way his knee bounced with nervous energy. When our eyes met, I didn't look away. Let him see what he'd created. Let him see the woman who'd learned to stand in storms. The proceedings started with formalities, names, dates, procedural matters that Laura had prepared me for, but that still felt surreal. Then came the evidence. Laura presented it methodically. The forged signatures, the shell accounts, the property transfers, the witness statements. Each piece built on the last, creating a picture so damning that even I, who'd lived through it, felt shocked by the totality of it. Daniel's attorney tried to counter, suggesting I was misremembering, that signatures were consensual, that this was all a misunderstanding between spouses. But then Laura played Mrs. Whitaker's recording, and the courtroom went silent except for Daniel's voice, tinny but clear through the speakers. "You'd be nothing without me." I watched Daniel's face as he listened to his own words weaponized against him. Watched him shrink in his expensive suit. The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses on a chain, looked at him with an expression I'd seen before, the same one my mother had worn when she'd met Daniel for the first time. Disapproval, mixed with something like resignation. Like she'd seen 1,000 men like him and knew exactly how this story went. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you'll have your chance to testify. But I suggest you think very carefully about what you say under oath." During recess, I escaped to the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror, taking steadying breaths. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up. I pressed them flat against the cool marble counter and counted backwards from 10. The door opened, and an older woman entered. One of the court reporters, I thought, though I wasn't sure. She washed her hands at the sink next to me and caught my eye in the mirror. "First time?" she asked kindly. "That obvious?" "You have the look." She dried her hands carefully. "For what it's worth, you're doing great. And Judge Peterson doesn't suffer fools or abusers. You're in good hands." After she left, I stared at my reflection for another long moment. The woman looking back at me had steady eyes and straight shoulders. She looked tired, but she looked strong. She looked like someone who could weather this. She looked like me. Daniel took the stand after lunch, and I watched him try to charm the judge the way he'd charmed business partners, investors, everyone who'd ever given him anything. But charm only works when people want to believe you, and Judge Peterson clearly didn't. "You're saying your wife willingly signed documents she never read?" the judge asked. "She trusted me to handle our finances. It's not unusual in a marriage." "And when you discovered the accounts were under investigation, what was your first action?" Daniel hesitated. "I tried to discuss it with Claire." "You tried to discuss it? Is that what you call showing up at her attorney's residence and attempting to force entry?" His attorney jumped in, objecting on some technical ground I didn't understand, but the damage was done. I could see it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the court reporter's barely concealed frown. When it was my turn to testify, Laura had prepared me to be clinical, factual, unemotional. But when she asked me to describe the night Daniel left me in the rain, something in me broke open. He said I needed to learn my place. I said, my voice steady despite the tears I could feel building. He drove me to a rural road in a storm and told me to walk home. It was dark and I had no phone, and I was terrified. But the worst part? I looked directly at Daniel. The worst part was that I still went home after. I still thought I deserved it. The courtroom was silent. "When did that change?" Laura asked gently. "When a friend found me and showed me the truth. When I realized the only person who deserved to stand in the rain was the man who'd made cruelty into a lesson." The judge's ruling came 3 days later. Full dissolution of marriage. Restraining order granted. All marital assets to be divided according to their actual legal ownership, which meant Daniel walked away with almost nothing, since nearly everything had been mine to begin with, either through inheritance or through the trust my father had established. The financial fraud charges would be handled separately, in criminal court, but the judge made her opinion clear in her written judgment. Mr. Caldwell's pattern of manipulation, financial abuse, and psychological cruelty represents a profound betrayal of marital trust and legal responsibility. I read that line 3 times, sitting in Laura's office with rain pattering against the windows. A profound betrayal.
Yes.
That's exactly what it had been. But I'd survived it. More than survived. I'd escaped it. How do you feel? Laura asked. I thought about it, really examined the tangle of emotions in my chest. Relief, yes. Sadness for what I'd lost, or thought I'd lost. Anger at the years stolen. But underneath it all, something new and fragile and impossibly precious.
Hope.
Free, I said finally. I feel free. Daniel's final attempt came 2 weeks after the judgment. I'd moved into a small apartment downtown, something temporary while I figured out what came next, and was coming home from a therapy session when I saw him in the parking garage. He looked terrible, unshaven, his clothes rumpled, eyes red-rimmed and desperate. For a moment, my instinct was to help him, to smooth away his distress the way I'd done 1,000 times before. Then I remembered, and my hand moved to my phone instead. Claire, please. He took a step forward, and I took one back, maintaining distance. Please, just let me explain. Stay back, Daniel. You're violating the restraining order. I just need to talk to you. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking.
No.
The word felt powerful, simple and absolute. Anything you need to say can go through my attorney. Your attorney. He laughed, the sound brittle and wrong. The attorney who poisoned you against me, who turned you into someone I don't even recognize. I was always this person, I interrupted. You just never bothered to see it. You only saw what you wanted me to be. Something shifted in his expression, anger rising to replace desperation. You think you've won? You think you can just destroy everything we built and walk away? You destroyed it. I'm just walking away from the rubble. He moved forward, and I had my phone up instantly. I'm calling the police.
Right now.
You have 5 seconds to leave. For a moment, I thought he might push it, might close the distance and force a confrontation. But then he seemed to deflate, all the rage leaking out of him to leave nothing but a broken man in an expensive suit he could no longer afford. You turned everyone against me, he said quietly. You did that the moment you made cruelty into a lesson. I'd said it before, in court, but it felt important to say it again. To make sure he understood that everything that had happened to him was a consequence of his own choices. He left without another word, and I stood in that parking garage for a long time after, shaking with adrenaline and relief, and something that felt almost like grief. The police came anyway, because I'd hit dial before he'd started to leave. They took my statement, documented the violation, added it to the growing file. Another brick in the wall that separated my life from his. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all finally settling. I'd spent months in survival mode, months moving from crisis to crisis, and now that it was over, really truly over, I didn't know quite what to do with myself. I pulled out my old sketchbook, the one with the designs I'd drawn years ago, and flipped through pages of half-finished rooms and abandoned dreams. On a blank page near the back, I started drawing something new.
Not a room this time.
A building. Glass and light and open space, the kind of place where people could feel safe, where they could feel seen. By dawn, I had rough sketches for what would eventually become my studio. I didn't know that yet, didn't know how many years it would take to build or how many lives it would touch. I just knew that for the first time in forever, I was creating something that was entirely mine. The news that Daniel's criminal case had concluded came via text from Laura, guilty on 3 counts of fraud. Sentenced to 18 months, eligible for parole in 12. He's done. I was in a cafe when I got the message, sunlight streaming through the window, a sketchbook open in front of me. I read it twice, waiting to feel something dramatic, triumph, vindication, satisfaction. Instead, I just felt tired and sad for the man I'd thought I'd married, the one who'd maybe never existed at all. I texted back, "Thank you for everything." Her response came immediately. "You did this." "I just filed the paperwork." "Coffee next week to celebrate?" "Yes." "And Laura? Thank you for finding me in the rain." Best coincidence of my life. Except it hadn't been coincidence, I'd learned later. Mrs. Whitaker had called Laura's office that night, frantic with worry after watching Daniel drag me to the car. Laura had been on her way to check on me when she'd found me at that bus stop. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the universe sends you lifelines disguised as old friends and concerned neighbors and the courage you didn't know you still had. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I opened Rainlight Designs in a converted loft downtown. The name came to me one morning while watching the sun break through storm clouds, that particular quality of light that only comes after rain, when everything looks washed clean and new. My first client was a woman leaving an abusive marriage. She needed her apartment redesigned, she said, so it felt like hers and only hers. No memories of him in any corner. I understood that particular kind of exorcism. We spent hours talking about what made her feel safe, what colors brought her peace, what kind of light she wanted to wake up to. By the time we finished, we designed more than a living space. We designed a sanctuary. At the reveal, she cried. "It feels strong," she said, "but also kind. I didn't know you could have both." I thought about that a lot. How strength and kindness weren't opposites but complements. How the strongest people I'd met were often the kindest, because they knew what it was like to need kindness and not receive it. The journalist from the business section called again, this time wanting to do a profile. Local woman turns tragedy into triumph, or some equally dramatic headline. I almost said no, but Laura convinced me. "Your story matters," she said. "It might help someone else." So I agreed to the interview, and the journalist showed up with a photographer and a list of questions that made me uncomfortable in their directness. "What would you say to other women in similar situations?" she asked. I thought carefully before answering. That you're not crazy. That if something feels wrong, it probably is. And that leaving doesn't make you weak. Staying would have killed something essential in me. Leaving saved my life. What was the turning point? When I stopped asking for forgiveness, I didn't know. That became the pull quote, printed in bold beneath a photo of me standing in my studio, sunlight streaming through the windows. I looked confident in the photo, self-assured. The article ran on a Sunday, and by Monday morning my phone was ringing with new client inquiries. Women mostly, who said things like, "I saw your story, and I understand what you mean about sanctuary, and can you help me make a home that feels safe?" I said yes to all of them. Laura took me out to celebrate when Rainlight Designs landed its first major commercial contract. We went to a rooftop restaurant, ordered too much wine, and laughed until our sides hurt over nothing and everything. "You could have destroyed him more, you know," Laura said, suddenly serious. "The criminal charges, I could have pushed for more. There was enough evidence." "I know." I swirled wine in my glass, watching light refract through it. "But he destroyed himself. I didn't need to help." She studied me for a long moment. "You're different from when I found you in the rain." "Different how?" "Softer. Which sounds wrong, given everything, but you're less defended. Like you don't need armor anymore." She was right. The constant vigilance had faded. I no longer calculated every word before speaking or monitored someone else's mood to gauge my safety. I just existed, fully and completely myself. "You gave me my life back," I said.
No.
Laura shook her head firmly. "You did that." I just drove the car. A letter arrived 3 months later, forwarded through Laura's office. Daniel's handwriting, instantly recognizable despite the shakiness of it. I almost threw it away unread. But curiosity, or maybe closure, won out. "Claire, I don't know what I thought love was. I thought it was control. I thought if I could shape you into what I needed, that would be enough. But it was never about you. It was about the terror of not being enough myself. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then. You were always whole. I was the broken one. I hope you're happy. Really happy. The kind you deserve. Daniel. I read it 3 times, then once more. Then I walked to the fireplace in my studio, where I kept a small flame burning during design sessions, and burned the letter. Not from anger, but from completion. From the understanding that some stories end not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet recognition that they're over. The ashes drifted up the chimney, and I returned to my drafting table where I was designing a community center, a safe space for families in transition. More than an ending, I thought. A beginning. Rain came again on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of sudden summer storm that arrives without warning. I was walking back from a client meeting when the first drops fell, and my instinct was to run for cover. But I didn't. I stood on the sidewalk and let the rain fall on me, let it soak through my blazer and plaster my hair to my head. People rushed past with umbrellas and newspapers held over their heads, but I just stood there, face tilted up to the sky. It felt different now. Not cruel or punishing, but cleansing. Baptismal almost. A woman stopped beside me, holding a bright yellow umbrella. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. I smiled at her, this kind stranger. "I'm perfect, actually. Just remembering something." She looked at me like I was crazy, but that was okay. I understood now that sometimes the most rational thing you can do is stand in the rain and remember that you survived the storm. That evening, I opened my journal, the one where I'd once written "one day I'll walk away dry," and added a new entry. He left me in the rain to teach me humility. But the lesson wasn't mine to learn. I learned instead that I was stronger than his cruelty, larger than his need to make me small. I learned that sometimes you have to let yourself get soaked to remember you won't drown. I learned that freedom tastes like rain and looks like sunlight and feels like designing spaces where other people can finally breathe. I learned that I was always whole. I was always enough. I just had to remember. The studio grew over the years. I hired assistants, took on bigger projects, got written up in design magazines. But my favorite work remained the private clients, the ones who came in carrying trauma and left with blueprints for healing. One particularly meaningful project came from a women's shelter. They needed a redesign that felt safe without feeling institutional, warm without being childish. I worked with residents to understand what they needed, what made them feel secure. At the opening ceremony, one of the women approached me. "You get it," she said simply. "You understand what it's like." "I do," I replied. "And I'm so glad you're here, that you made it here." She smiled. "So am I." That was the work, I realized. Not just designing beautiful spaces, but creating environments where people could remember who they were before trauma taught them to be small. Years later, I stood in my studio on a rainy evening, looking at the sketches pinned to my walls. Projects completed and in progress, dreams made real through glass and light and careful attention to what made people feel safe. My phone buzzed, a text from a potential client. "I read about your story. I need help creating a home where I can heal.
Can you help me?"
I smiled and typed back, "Yes. When can we meet?" Because that was the other lesson, the one that mattered most. Healing wasn't something that happened in isolation. It happened in community, in connection, in the spaces we created for ourselves and each other. The rain continued to fall outside my window, drops racing down the glass and catching the light from inside. I'd learned to love that sound again, learned that rain wasn't punishment but renewal, wasn't ending but transformation. He'd left me in the rain thinking it would break me. Instead, it had washed away everything that wasn't essential, everything that wasn't true, until all that remained was the woman I'd always been underneath the fear.
Whole. Strong. Free.
And absolutely, beautifully myself. Here's a question for you. If you discovered you'd been living someone else's lie, would you have the courage to burn it all down and start over? If this story moved you, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about survival, strength, and second chances.